June 8, 1943, Philadelphia State Hospital, Ward B. Samuel Yoder pushed open the heavy metal door and the smell hit him first. Urine, feces, unwashed bodies, and something worse underneath that he couldn't name. The ward stretched before him, 60 beds crammed into space designed for 30. Men lay strapped to iron frames, some silent, others moaning. The summer heat made it worse. No ventilation. Flies everywhere. Yoder wore plain clothes, dark pants, suspenders, the simple garb of his Amish community in Lancaster County, no uniform, no insignia. At 22 years old, he'd been drafted under the Selective Service Act, but refused to bear arms. His faith demanded non-resistance, no killing, no violence, no war. The hospital attendant, a tired-looking man named Harris, glanced at Yoder's civilian clothes with barely concealed contempt. "You one of those CPS boys?" Yoder nodded. "Figures." Harris gestured toward the ward. "Most of the regular staff left for factory jobs. Better pay. You conscientious objectors can clean this up." Yoder walked between the beds. One patient, maybe 40 years old, lay in his own waste. His wrists showed rope burns from restraints. Another man in the corner had open sores that hadn't been treated. A third was so thin, Yoder could count his ribs through the hospital gown. What Yoder was witnessing, and what the 500 Amish and Mennonite men assigned to 60 civilian public service hospital units would document between 1942 and 1946, was systematic neglect in American psychiatric institutions that had killed thousands through starvation, untreated disease and abuse. The men ridiculed as cowards for refusing to fight would expose conditions that shocked medical professionals, save over 1,000 lives through basic humanitarian care, and launch the mental health reform movement that transformed American psychiatric treatment in the decades after World War II. The draft notice arrived at the Yoder farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on November 3, 1940. Samuel's father brought it from the mailbox, the envelope bearing the official seal of the United States Selective Service System. The family gathered in the kitchen that evening after chores, Samuel, his parents, his 2 younger brothers, and read the document that would force them to choose between faith and country. The Selective Training and Service Act had become law 6 weeks earlier, requiring all men aged 21 to 35 to register for military service. America wasn't yet at war, but President Roosevelt insisted the nation must prepare. Germany controlled most of Europe. Britain fought alone. Japan expanded through Asia. The draft was coming whether anyone wanted it or not. For Samuel Yoder and thousands of young Amish and Mennonite men across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Kansas, and Iowa, the draft represented crisis that challenged 3 centuries of religious tradition. Their faith, rooted in Anabaptist theology dating to 16th century, Reformation, demanded non-resistance, no violence, no killing, no participation in warfare regardless of cause or circumstance. The principle wasn't negotiable. It was fundamental to who they were. But the law was equally clear. Refusal to register meant 5 years in federal prison and $10,000 fine. The Selective Service Act included provisions for conscientious objectors based on religious belief, but those provisions required cooperation with government authority that some Amish bishops questioned. Was registering for the draft, even with conscientious objector status, a form of cooperation with war machinery? Did filling out government forms acknowledge state authority over conscience? The theological debate divided communities. Samuel's family belonged to a congregation whose bishop permitted registration as conscientious objector. The alternative, prison, would separate young men from their communities, families, and faith traditions for years. Better to work within the law's provisions than suffer punishment that served no one. Other congregations reached different conclusions, and their young men would spend the war in federal prisons rather than register. The Selective Service Act created classification VEE for conscientious objectors who would perform work of national importance under civilian direction. The compromise satisfied no one completely. Military officials viewed conscientious objectors as cowards hiding behind religious excuses. Newspaper editorials questioned whether democracy should accommodate citizens who refused to defend it. Neighbors whose sons were enlisting looked at Amish men staying home with contempt that didn't require words. Within pacifist communities, the compromise generated its own tensions. Some Amish bishops worried that accepting alternative service acknowledged government's right to compel labor during wartime. Others feared that young men serving in government camps would be exposed to worldly influences that would pull them from their faith. The Pennsylvania Dutch newspaper Die Botschaft published debates about whether cooperation with civilian public service represented unacceptable compromise with the state. By December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America entered the war, approximately 12,000 men had registered as conscientious objectors. The number included 4,665 Mennonites, several hundred Amish, Quakers, Brethren, Jehovah's Witnesses, and men from various other religious backgrounds or personal convictions. Of those, roughly 6,000 refused any cooperation with selective service and went to prison. About 25,000 accepted non-combatant military service as medics or chaplains. The remaining 12,000 were assigned to civilian public service camps. The CPS program operated through agreement between selective service and 3 historic peace churches, Mennonites, Brethren, and Quakers. The churches administered camps, provided food and housing, and supervised work. Assignments. The men received no wages. Their families had to pay $35 monthly for their maintenance. The work was deliberately hard. Forestry, soil conservation, agriculture, fighting forest fires, assignments designed to demonstrate that conscientious objectors weren't shirking duty, but serving through different means. For Samuel Yoder, the assignment came in May 1943. Report to Philadelphia State Hospital, Civilian Public Service Camp 1-41. Work assignment, psychiatric attendant. The hospital needed staff. Regular attendants had left for higher-paying factory jobs supporting war production. The state couldn't maintain facilities without help. CPS workers would fill the gap. Yoder traveled to Philadelphia on June 7, 1943. He'd never been to a city before. He'd certainly never seen a psychiatric hospital. When he walked through Ward B the next morning and saw 60 men crammed into space designed for 30, patients lying in their own waste, open sores untreated, restraints leaving rope burns on wrists, he understood that his assignment would test his principles in ways battlefield combat never would, because the enemy wasn't soldiers with guns but institutional neglect that had been killing American citizens for years while society looked away. Samuel Yoder's first full shift at Philadelphia State Hospital began at 6 o'clock in the morning on June 9, 1943. Ward B held 350 patients. 4 attendants were scheduled for the morning shift. 2 called in sick. That left Yoder and 1 experienced attendant, a man named Morrison who'd worked at Byberry for 8 years, to manage nearly 200 men classified as violent or difficult. Morrison handed Yoder a ring of keys. Lock doors behind you. Never turn your back. If they rush you, blow the whistle. He pointed to a whistle hanging on a cord. Other wards will send help if they can spare someone. The ward looked worse in daylight than it had the previous day. Patients lay on iron beds pushed against walls in rows so tight there was barely room to walk between them. Some beds lacked mattresses. Men lay on bare metal frames. Others had mattresses so soiled they'd hardened into shapes that no longer resembled bedding. The smell, urine, feces, infection, sweat, was overpowering in the June heat. Windows were sealed shut, no air circulation. Flies moved in clouds. One patient approached Yoder, shuffling in slippers without laces. His hospital gown hung open, revealing ribs that showed through skin stretched tight over bones. The man's arms were covered in bruises, old ones yellowing, newer ones purple-black. He asked for water. His lips were cracked and bleeding. Yoder filled a cup from a sink and handed it to him. The man drank desperately, then held out the cup for more. Morrison saw this and called out, "Don't give him extra. They'll all want it." Yoder refilled the cup anyway. The man drank again and shuffled away. By mid-morning, Yoder understood the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Philadelphia State Hospital, officially renamed from the Philadelphia Hospital for Mental Diseases in 1938 after investigations exposed abuse, had been designed for 3,000 patients. It currently held over 6,100. Ward B, designed for perhaps 150, contained more than twice that number. The patient-to-staff ratio averaged 1 attendant per 100 patients during day shifts. At night it was worse, sometimes 1 attendant per 300. The understaffing wasn't new, but wartime had made it catastrophic. Regular attendants had left for factory jobs paying twice what the state hospital offered. The draft took others. By 1943, most wards operated with skeleton crews unable to provide basic care even if they'd wanted to. Patients went unfed because there weren't enough staff to distribute meals. They lay in soiled bedding because no one had time to change sheets. Infections went untreated because doctors couldn't examine hundreds of patients daily with any thoroughness. But the physical neglect was only part of what Yoder discovered. The previous staff had maintained control through violence. A patient on Ward B pointed to a corner where attendants had beaten difficult men with clubs. Another described being hit with a sawed-off broom handle. A third showed scars on his back from a hose filled with buckshot that staff had used as a weapon. The violence wasn't officially sanctioned, but administrators had tolerated it as necessary for managing violent wards. CPS worker Warren Sawyer, who'd arrived at Byberry 2 months before Yoder, documented conditions in letters home. He described days when ceilings collapsed, when doors were nailed shut because hinges had broken and no one repaired them, when lights went out because circuit breakers failed and electrical systems remained unfixed. The infrastructure was literally crumbling. Patients lived in buildings falling apart around them. The training CPS workers received before starting ward duty proved useless. Hospital administrators provided classes on mental illness and therapeutic treatment techniques. The instruction was, according to CPS worker Hal Barton, idealistic, with contrast between the ideal and the practical day-to-day ward situation so striking as to be upsetting to say the least. Nothing in the training prepared them for men dying from preventable causes, while staff watched helplessly or indifferently. Yoder began keeping notes. Which patients showed signs of tuberculosis? Who had untreated infections? Which men were losing weight from inadequate feeding? He wrote down what he observed, trying to document conditions systematically. Other CPS workers did the same. Warren Sawyer had access to a camera. He began taking photographs, covert images of naked men huddling together for warmth, of patients lying in their own waste, of human excrement lining hallway floors. The documentation was motivated by religious conviction as much as humanitarian concern. The Amish and Mennonite, men serving at Byberry, believed their faith demanded they serve the least of these, the marginalized, forgotten, suffering people society rejected. The patients at state psychiatric hospitals were among the most forgotten. Families had committed them and never visited. Society had warehoused them and tried to forget they existed. Staff viewed them as incurable burdens rather than human beings deserving dignity. The CPS workers' pacifism informed their approach to patient care. They refused to use violence for control. When patients became agitated, the CPS men talked to them, tried to understand what was wrong, addressed needs rather than punishing behavior. The approach wasn't sophisticated psychiatry, it was basic human decency that previous staff had abandoned. By late 1943, mortality rates in CPS-staffed wards had begun to decrease measurably compared to years when violence-prone attendants had managed the same patients. The improvement came from simple interventions: feeding patients adequately, maintaining basic hygiene, treating infections, eliminating beatings. The fact that such elementary care produced measurable results exposed how thoroughly the system had failed. But documenting horror and providing immediate care weren't the same as fixing the system. Administrators resented the CPS workers' implied criticism. Overworked professional staff viewed the conscientious objectors with contempt, religious zealots who refused to fight but thought they knew better than experienced attendants. And patients continued suffering in wards where CPS workers hadn't been assigned, where violence and neglect continued unchanged. Saving lives one ward at a time wouldn't transform American psychiatric care unless someone forced society to confront what was happening in institutions taxpayers funded but preferred not to think about. Samuel Yoder's third week at Philadelphia State Hospital began with a simple decision that would save a life. A patient on Ward B, a man named Charles, who'd been institutionalized for 15 years, had been refusing meals for 3 days. The previous attendants had noted his refusal in records and moved on. Patients who didn't eat weren't forced. If they died, they died. Yoder sat beside Charles's bed and asked why he wasn't eating. Charles pointed to his mouth. His teeth were rotted, many missing entirely. The institutional food, hard bread, tough meat, caused him pain to chew. So, he didn't eat. The solution was obvious. Yoder went to the kitchen and requested soft foods. The cook initially refused. Special meals weren't provided. Yoder persisted. Eventually, the cook agreed to prepare oatmeal, mashed potatoes, soup. Charles began eating again. Within 2 weeks, Charles had gained 8 pounds. Within a month, he was strong enough to help with light ward duties. The intervention required no medical expertise, just observation, compassion, and willingness to solve a problem others had ignored. The pattern repeated across 60 psychiatric hospitals where CPS units operated between 1943 and 1946. At Cleveland State Hospital, CPS worker Alex Sarian noticed patients with tuberculosis weren't isolated from healthy patients, spreading infection throughout wards. He advocated for segregated TB units. Mortality from tuberculosis decreased measurably after implementation. At Connecticut Valley Hospital, CPS men organized recreational activities, baseball games, music programs, outdoor time, giving patients stimulation beyond confinement in locked wards. Behavior staff had attributed to mental illness diminished when patients received engagement rather than sedation. At Maryland State Hospital, CPS Camp 49, conscientious objectors documented that patients were dying from dysentery caused by contaminated water supplies. They pushed administrators to fix plumbing. Deaths from waterborne illness dropped. At Ypsilanti State Hospital in Michigan, CPS workers ended the practice of restraining patients for days at a time as punishment for difficult behavior. They found that treating patients with respect reduced violence more effectively than punitive restraint. The improvements demonstrated uncomfortable truth. Institutional neglect rather than medical impossibility was killing patients. Men labeled hopeless and incurable gained weight when fed properly. Infections healed with basic hygiene. Aggressive behaviors diminished when staff stopped beating patients. The interventions were so elementary, they exposed how thoroughly American psychiatric care had failed. By 1944, medical professionals began noticing the changes. Dr. Benjamin Pasamanik at Cleveland State Hospital wrote that CPS workers had saved many lives through devotion to patients and determination to provide humane care. Dr. William Bryan at Harrisburg State Hospital credited conscientious objectors with reducing mortality rates by over 20% in wards they staffed. The doctors' testimonies validated what the CPS men had been documenting. that basic humanitarian treatment produced measurable health outcomes, the success came from religious conviction as much as humanitarian concern. The Amish and Mennonite CPS workers believed their faith demanded they serve suffering people with the same care they'd provide family members. They bathed patients gently, spoke to them respectfully, listened when they talked, treated them as human beings rather than problems to manage. The approach wasn't sophisticated medical treatment. It was recognition of human dignity that professional staff had lost. But the improvements revealed how completely American society had abandoned psychiatric patients. The same nation fighting for freedom and democracy overseas operated institutions where citizens died from starvation and preventable disease. The contrast was morally indefensible. Communities that sent sons to fight tyranny in Europe had created domestic tyranny through systematic neglect of their most vulnerable. The CPS workers began pushing for reforms beyond immediate care. They wrote letters to state legislators describing conditions. They contacted journalists. Warren Sawyer smuggled photographs out of Byberry showing naked patients huddling together, men lying in their own waste, human feces covering hallway floors. The images were shocking. The fact that they documented conditions in state-funded institutions made them scandalous. Hospital administrators responded with hostility. Dr. Charles Zeller, superintendent at Philadelphia State Hospital, viewed the CPS workers' activism as insubordination. He couldn't fire them, Selective Service assigned them, but he could make their work difficult. He denied requests for improved supplies. He blocked proposed policy changes. He defended existing practices as necessary, given limited resources. Other administrators were more receptive. Some recognized that CPS workers were exposing problems that needed addressing, but receptive administrators still faced budget constraints, political resistance, and institutional inertia. Fixing psychiatric hospitals required money state legislatures wouldn't appropriate for populations voters preferred to forget. By late 1944, CPS workers had documented evidence that would eventually force public reckoning with American psychiatric care. They'd photographed conditions. They'd recorded testimony from patients and staff. They'd compiled statistics on mortality rates, malnutrition, untreated disease, and they demonstrated through their own care that patients labeled hopeless could improve dramatically when treated humanely. But documentation and direct care weren't enough to transform the system. Over 3,000 CPS workers served in 62 psychiatric hospitals during WW2s. They improved conditions in wards they staffed. They saved approximately 1,000 lives through interventions so basic they should never have been necessary. Yet tens of thousands of patients in wards without CPS workers continued suffering under conditions unchanged. And even in CPS-staffed facilities, improvements were temporary unless someone forced systemic reform that would outlast the conscientious objector's wartime service. The quiet courage that had saved individual lives now needed amplification, publicity that would shock American society into confronting what it had been doing to its most vulnerable citizens while claiming to fight for human dignity overseas. The idea that would eventually create Philadelphia State Hospital began with hope rather than horror. In 1844, Dorothea Dix testified before the New Jersey legislature describing conditions she'd witnessed: mentally ill citizens confined in county jails, chained in basements, caged in poorhouses. She demanded reform. Her testimony launched a movement that would transform American psychiatric care. The reform was built on moral treatment, European theories promising cure through humane care in pastoral settings. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, superintendent at Pennsylvania Hospital's Institute for Mental Diseases, developed architectural plans for asylums that would facilitate healing. The Kirkbride plan called for buildings with long rambling wings arranged to maximize sunlight and fresh air, landscaped grounds providing peaceful settings, and capacity limited to 250 patients to ensure individualized attention. The philosophy was revolutionary for its time. Previous generations had treated mental illness with chains, cages, and isolation. Moral treatment promised recovery through kindness, meaningful work, recreation, and appeal to patients' remaining rationality. Families who could afford private care saw remarkable results. Wealthy patients at McLean Hospital near Boston, Bloomingdale Asylum in Manhattan, and similar institutions received treatment that produced genuine improvements. Reformers like Dix demanded that treatment available to wealthy be extended to poor. State legislatures responded by funding public asylums built on Kirkbride principles. By 1870, virtually every state had at least one such facility supported by tax dollars and promising cure for mental illness regardless of patients' ability to pay. But the idealistic origins collapsed under pressures the reformers hadn't anticipated. Local governments discovered they could avoid costs of caring for elderly poor by redefining senility as a psychiatric problem and transferring those individuals to state-funded asylums. Communities sent residents who were disruptive, alcoholic, suffering from dementia, or simply unwanted. The patient population exploded beyond anything Kirkbride's designs could accommodate. New York State Care Act of 1890 required states to assume financial responsibility for all mentally ill citizens previously housed in local almshouses and county facilities. The legislation was intended to improve care through centralized administration. Instead, it transferred financial burden from local communities to state hospitals without providing corresponding funding increases. Between 1903 and 1940, patient admissions to state mental hospitals increased 240%. The hospitals built for 250 patients held 2,000. Facilities designed for individualized moral treatment became warehouses practicing custodial containment. By the 1940s, American state psychiatric institutions held over 450,000 patients, double their design capacity. Philadelphia State Hospital, designed for 3,000, held over 6,100. Similar overcrowding existed across the nation. Staffing ratios made individualized treatment impossible. State hospitals averaged one physician per 300 patients, one attendant per 100 patients. Doctors couldn't examine hundreds of patients meaningfully. Attendants couldn't provide basic care to dozens of severely ill individuals simultaneously. The institutions designed to cure mental illness through humane attention devolved into facilities that warehoused patients with minimal supervision. Scientific theories reinforced the collapse. Late 19th and early 20th century psychiatry increasingly viewed mental illness as incurable biological defect rather than condition responsive to treatment. If patients were incurable, investment in treatment seemed wasteful. The institutions became holding facilities rather than hospitals, places where society sent people it found uncomfortable and wanted to forget. State legislatures chronically underfunded psychiatric hospitals despite growing populations. Politicians faced no electoral pressure to increase appropriations for institutions housing citizens who couldn't vote, whose families had often abandoned them, and whom communities preferred not to think about. The budget crises were permanent, getting worse each year as patient numbers grew while funding remained stagnant or decreased. World War II exacerbated every existing problem. Hospital attendants left for better-paying factory jobs supporting war production. The draft took other staff. By 1943, facilities that had been understaffed for decades operated with skeleton crews unable to provide even minimal care. Patients went unfed because no one distributed meals. They lay in soiled bedding because no one changed sheets. They died from preventable causes because no one noticed or cared enough to intervene. The physical infrastructure crumbled. Buildings constructed in 1870s and 1880s needed maintenance states wouldn't fund. Roofs leaked, plumbing failed, electrical systems sparked fires, windows broke and remained broken. The pastoral settings Kirkbride envisioned became prisons where patients suffered in facilities literally falling apart around them. Public attention focused elsewhere. Communities fighting war overseas had little interest in domestic institutional problems. Newspapers covered battles in Europe and Pacific, not conditions in state hospitals. Politicians prioritized military production and veteran services over psychiatric care. The neglect was systematic and bipartisan. No one wanted to allocate resources to populations society preferred to forget. The systemic collapse revealed how societies dealt with uncomfortable populations. Americans created institutions that isolated mentally ill citizens from view, then systematically underfunded those institutions while maintaining public illusion that proper care was being provided. The reality that state-funded facilities operated as concentration camps where citizens died from starvation and preventable disease existed in willful ignorance sustained by isolation that kept conditions hidden from public view. The crisis created opportunity for reform only because CPS workers broke the isolation. Their presence in hospitals as outsiders, men whose religious convictions demanded they serve the least of these, enabled them to see conditions that professional staff had normalized through familiarity or complicity. And their documentation, photographs, written reports, testimony, would eventually force public confrontation with what American society had been doing to its most vulnerable citizens while claiming to fight for human dignity and freedom overseas. The forgotten asylums were about to become impossible to ignore. The photographs arrived at Life magazine's editorial offices in New York during March 1946. Photographer Jerry Cook had spent weeks documenting conditions at Cleveland State Hospital and Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. The images showed naked men huddled together against walls for warmth, patients strapped to benches in restraints, emaciated bodies lying on bare floors, human waste covering hallways. To editors who'd recently published images from liberated Nazi concentration camps, the similarity was immediate and disturbing. Albert Q. Maisel had been investigating American psychiatric hospitals since 1945. He'd testified before congressional committees about conditions in Veterans Administration mental facilities. CPS workers had contacted him repeatedly with documentation, written reports, patient testimony, statistics on mortality rates. They'd provided access to hospitals where administrators would otherwise have blocked journalists. Now Maisel had photographic evidence shocking enough to force public attention. Life published Bedlam 1946 on May 6, 1946. The 12-page exposé opened with statement that captured its argument. Most U.S. mental hospitals are a shame and a disgrace. Maisel's text described conditions CPS workers had been documenting for years: overcrowding reaching 200% of capacity, patient-to-staff ratios making care impossible, systematic abuse covered by conspiracy of silence, deaths from preventable causes that would have been prosecuted as negligence or manslaughter in any other setting. But the photographs carried impact that text alone couldn't achieve. Jerry Cook's images from Cleveland State Hospital showed patients lined naked along walls, men crouched on floors in their own waste, individuals restrained for days in canvas wrappings. The images from Byberry were equally horrifying: overcrowded wards where patients had no privacy, no dignity, no hope. To Americans who just fought war against Nazi tyranny, the pictures looked like concentration camp photographs. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Letters flooded Life's offices, state legislatures, and governors' mansions. Citizens demanded investigations. Editorial boards called for reform. Church groups organized advocacy campaigns. The exposé had brought to mainstream attention what conscientious objectors had been documenting since 1942, that American psychiatric institutions operated as warehouses of systematic neglect, where citizens died from starvation and preventable disease, while communities remained ignorant or indifferent. The vindication came at uncomfortable time for those who'd ridiculed CPS workers as cowards. Amish, and Mennonite men who'd been mocked for refusing to fight were
now recognized as whistleblowers whose moral courage had exposed systemic failures most professionals had ignored or concealed. The men dismissed as draft dodgers had documented evidence that shocked the nation and forced institutional accountability that medical professionals, hospital administrators, and state officials had failed to provide. The testimony CPS workers had been giving since 1945 suddenly carried weight it had previously lacked. Warren Sawyer, who'd smuggled photographs out of Byberry, testified before Pennsylvania legislative committees investigating conditions. His documentation, supported now by Life's national platform, forced administrators who denied problems to acknowledge failures. Alex Sarian from Cleveland State Hospital provided evidence to grand juries investigating patient abuse. His testimony contributed to superintendent's resignation and criminal charges against abusive staff. Other journalists built on Maisel's work. Albert Deutsch published similar exposés in PM newspaper and later in his book, The Shame of the States, 1948. Frank Wright, a CPS worker, documented conditions in Out of Sight, Out of Mind, 1947. The accumulating evidence made denial impossible. State after state launched investigations that confirmed what CPS workers had been reporting, that psychiatric institutions had devolved into concentration camps operating with taxpayer funding, while citizens remained deliberately ignorant of conditions. Governors scrambled to address crises they'd previously dismissed. In Minnesota, Governor Luther Youngdahl hired Justin Reese, a CPS worker who'd exposed conditions at Cleveland State Hospital, to investigate Minnesota's 7 state mental hospitals. Reese's March 1948 report documented conditions identical to those Maisel had described nationally. Youngdahl went on radio May 5, 1948, and described to citizens the herds of patients lined up in chairs, sitting against walls, doing absolutely nothing that he'd witnessed during personal hospital visits. State legislatures appropriated emergency funding increases. Pennsylvania allocated millions for Byberry improvements. Ohio overhauled Cleveland State Hospital administration. Minnesota passed Mental Health Act of 1949, implementing reforms Reese recommended. The political response, though motivated partly by embarrassment that revelations had exposed official negligence, produced tangible improvements in facilities that had operated without meaningful oversight for decades. But the vindication revealed uncomfortable truth about reform. Professional medical organizations had known about institutional conditions for years. State officials had received reports documenting abuse and neglect. Families had complained about treatment their committed relatives received. Yet, systemic reform required outsiders, conscientious objectors motivated by religious conviction to serve marginalized populations, to document and publicize what insiders had, normalized through familiarity, complicity, or institutional self-protection. The CPS workers' outsider status had been essential to their effectiveness as reformers. They weren't invested in protecting institutional reputations. They didn't depend on state employment for their livelihoods. Their religious motivation to serve the least of these created commitment to patient welfare that overwhelmed pressures to remain silent about abuse, and their documentation, photographs, written reports, patient testimony, provided evidence that couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda once mainstream publications like Life gave it national platform. The success demonstrated how moral witness could achieve reforms that professional expertise alone hadn't accomplished. Psychiatrists had known about institutional failures, social workers had documented problems, medical associations had published reports. But exposure that forced public confrontation with conditions required individuals willing to sacrifice career prospects, social standing, and institutional loyalty to document truth that powerful interests preferred to conceal. Yet, exposure alone wouldn't transform American mental health care. The emergency funding increases and administrative reforms addressed immediate crises without restructuring fundamental system that had created those crises. State hospitals still operated under chronic underfunding, inadequate staffing, and social stigma that made meaningful reform politically difficult. The problem required decades of sustained effort, evolving psychiatric theory, new medications, and eventually deinstitutionalization movement that would close state hospitals in favor of community-based care. The CPS workers had forced crisis into public view, but transforming institutional culture that had normalized neglect for generations would require changes far beyond what whistleblowers alone could accomplish. President Harry S. Truman signed the National Mental Health Act on July 3, 1946, exactly 8 weeks after Life magazine published Bedlam 1946. The timing wasn't coincidental. Congressional support for the legislation had been building since Robert Felix of the Public Health Service first drafted the bill in 1945. But public outrage following Masel's expose provided political momentum that legislators couldn't ignore. The act made mental health a federal priority for the first time in American history. It established the National Institute of Mental Health, authorized federal funding for psychiatric research and professional training, and provided grants to states for establishing community mental health centers. The legislation represented fundamental shift from state-level custodial warehousing toward federally supported community-based treatment, emphasizing prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation rather than lifelong institutionalization. The bill built directly on evidence CPS workers had provided. During
congressional hearings in 1945 and early 1946, legislators heard testimony from conscientious objectors describing conditions they'd witnessed. Warren Sawyer presented photographs from Byberry. Alex Sarayan testified about mortality rates at Cleveland State Hospital. Former CPS workers provided statistical evidence documenting how basic humanitarian care reduced deaths in wards they'd staffed. The testimony convinced Congress that American psychiatric system required federal intervention to address conditions states had allowed to persist for decades. Robert Felix, the psychiatrist who'd orchestrated the legislation's passage, had been influenced by CPS workers' documentation. He'd visited hospitals where conscientious objectors served and witnessed improvements they'd implemented. His vision for community-based mental health care reflected principles CPS workers had demonstrated, that patients benefited more from treatment in smaller facilities with adequate staffing than from warehousing in massive state institutions where individual attention was impossible. The National Mental Health Act appropriations started small, $9 million in 1949 when NIMH officially came into existence, but funding grew steadily. By 1955, it reached $14 million. By 1959, it jumped to $50 million. By 1965, it hit $189 million. The increasing appropriations reflected growing federal commitment to transforming American psychiatric care from custodial model toward treatment-focused approach. The impact extended beyond funding. NIMH's creation legitimized mental health as field deserving serious scientific research rather than just custodial management. Federal support attracted talented researchers who might otherwise have pursued other medical specialties. The Institute funded development of psychotropic drugs, chlorpromazine, haloperidol, lithium, that would revolutionize treatment of schizophrenia, psychosis, and bipolar disorder. The medications allowed patients who would have required lifelong institutionalization to live in community settings with medication management. Former CPS workers continued reform activism after demobilization. Many pursued careers in social work, psychiatric nursing, and mental health administration, where they implemented humane care principles they developed during wartime service. Alex Sarayan became director of Cleveland State Hospital, transforming the institution where he'd served as CPS worker. Warren Sawyer worked with Mental Health America advocating for federal legislation and state-level reforms. Dozens of other former conscientious objectors entered mental health professions, bringing commitment to patient dignity that had motivated their wartime service. The reforms validated principle that moral conviction could drive social change when individuals willing to sacrifice comfort for conscience exposed injustices that comfortable society preferred to ignore. The CPS workers had been ridiculed as cowards when they refused military service, but their documentation of psychiatric hospital conditions and their demonstration that basic humanitarian care saved lives had launched reform movement that transformed American mental health policy. The transformation took decades to fully materialize. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963, signed by President Kennedy 17 years after the National Mental Health Act, authorized federal funding for comprehensive community mental health centers that would eventually replace state hospitals as primary treatment venues. The legislation built on foundation the 1946 Act established and reflected vision Robert Felix and CPS activists had articulated 20 years earlier. By the 1970s, state psychiatric hospitals began closing as deinstitutionalization movement gained momentum. The massive institutions where CPS workers had served, Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry, Cleveland State Hospital, Maryland State Hospital, reduced populations dramatically or shut down entirely. Patients were transferred to community mental health centers, halfway houses, and outpatient programs that provided treatment in less restrictive settings. But the reforms came too late for thousands who died in the asylums before CPS workers exposed conditions and before federal policy shifted toward community care. The patients Samuel Yoder had witnessed lying in their own waste on Ward B in June 1943, the men who died from starvation and preventable disease in 1942 and earlier, they received no benefit from reforms their suffering eventually prompted. The vindication was posthumous, the justice delayed beyond their lifetimes. And deinstitutionalization created new problems that reformers hadn't fully anticipated. Closing state hospitals without ensuring adequate community support left many former patients homeless or incarcerated. By the 1980s, jails and prisons had become de facto psychiatric institutions, holding individuals whose mental illnesses would have resulted in hospitalization in previous generations, but who now cycled through criminal justice system lacking proper treatment. The pendulum had swung from over-institutionalization to inadequate support, creating different failures that troubled advocates who'd fought to close the warehouses. Yet despite incomplete implementation and unintended consequences, the transformation launched by CPS activism represented genuine progress. American society had confronted reality that taxpayer-funded institutions had operated as concentration camps where citizens died from systematic neglect. Federal policy had shifted from ignoring psychiatric care toward supporting research, training, and community-based treatment, and moral witness by conscientious objectors dismissed as cowards had proven that courage took forms beyond battlefield valor, including the strength to document suffering that society preferred to ignore and to demand accountability from systems that had failed their most vulnerable citizens for generations. 60 years after Samuel Yoder walked into Ward B at Philadelphia State Hospital, historians examining American mental health reform recognized that the conscientious objectors dismissed as cowards during World War II had demonstrated courage of a different kind, the strength to maintain moral principles under social pressure and to serve humanity in ways society devalued. The statistics told part of the story. Between 1941 and 1947, approximately 12,000 men served in civilian public service. They contributed over 8 million days of unpaid service, equivalent to 21,000 man-years of labor. The men worked in 151 CPS camps and units across America, performing forestry, soil conservation, agriculture, healthcare, and experimental medical research. They received no wages, Their families paid $35 monthly for their maintenance. Communities ridiculed them as draft dodgers and cowards, hiding behind religious excuses. Yet their alternative service achieved outcomes that conventional military service never addressed. CPS workers fought 4,000 forest fires, planting millions of trees, built trails and fire roads across national forests, conducted agricultural research that improved crop yields, and served as subjects in medical experiments testing vaccines and treatments. The 60 CPS units assigned to psychiatric hospitals documented conditions that led directly to National Mental Health Act of 1946 and subsequent reforms that transformed American psychiatric care. The vindication came not through public apology or belated recognition, but through outcomes. Approximately 1,000 lives saved in psychiatric hospitals through basic humanitarian care. Mental health reform movement launched by documentation and testimony that forced society to confront institutional failures. Demonstration that pacifist principles didn't require passivity when channeled into active service addressing society's most pressing needs. For Amish and Mennonite CPS workers specifically, roughly 4,665 Mennonites and several hundred Amish among the 12,000 total, the service reflected centuries of religious tradition dating to 16th century Anabaptist theology. Their faith communities had maintained pacifist witness through wars, persecution, migration, and assimilation pressures. The CPS experience tested whether those principles could survive modern total war when society demanded uniform patriotic expression. The communal support sustained individual commitment. Gordon Zahn, Catholic sociologist who studied CPS objectors, found that Mennonite draftees received strong encouragement from pastors, family, and church communities. Their conscientious objector claims on selective service forms were brief and direct, often citing scripture chapter and verse, showing community preparation rather than isolated individual decision. The pacifism was communal tradition passed through generations rather than personal philosophical position. Developed independently, many CPS workers continued service after demobilization. Alex Sarian became hospital administrator, implementing reforms he'd advocated as CPS worker. Warren Sawyer worked with mental health advocacy organizations. Dozens entered social work, psychiatric nursing, and mental health administration. Others founded alternative institutions. Mennonite Mental Health Services, established in 1947, created psychiatric facilities operated according to principles CPS workers developed during wartime service. Rather than reforming existing institutions, Mennonites built parallel systems reflecting their values about human dignity and compassionate care. The legacy revealed deeper truth about courage. It wasn't defined exclusively by willingness to fight, but by capacity to act according to conviction, even when doing so brought ridicule, required sacrifice, and challenged majority opinion about how citizens should serve their country. The Amish and Mennonite men who refused to kill demonstrated that moral courage could be as demanding as physical bravery, requiring strength to maintain principles under social pressure that viewed pacifism as cowardice. The experience tested relationship between conscience and citizenship in democracy. Could pluralistic society accommodate citizens whose deepest convictions contradicted majority will during national crisis? The Civilian Public Service Program, imperfect compromise satisfying neither military officials nor all pacifist communities, demonstrated that democracy could create space for principled dissent when institutions established pathways for conscience-driven service. But the accommodation came at cost the objectors bore. They served without wages while soldiers received military pay. They faced contempt from communities that viewed alternative service as shirking duty. They sacrificed years to labor that society devalued even when that labor addressed genuine social needs. The democratic tolerance wasn't generous, it was grudging acceptance that extracted maximum sacrifice from those exercising conscience rights. Yet the outcomes validated their witness. The psychiatric hospital reforms alone justified the CPS program's existence. Thousands of American citizens had died from systematic neglect in state-funded institutions, while society remained deliberately ignorant. CPS workers broke that isolation through documentation that forced public reckoning. Their moral conviction to serve the least of these motivated activism that professional expertise alone hadn't provided, and their demonstration that basic humanitarian treatment saved lives exposed how thoroughly institutional culture had normalized preventable suffering. The lesson endured beyond World War II. The all-volunteer force established in 1973 eliminated draft, but didn't resolve tensions about conscience and citizenship. Subsequent wars generated new debates about conscientious objection, selective, conscientious, objection to particular wars, and whether patriotism required uniform expressions of support or could embrace principled dissent. The CPS precedent demonstrated that democracy strengthened rather than weakened when it accommodated diverse forms of service based on genuine conviction. The Amish and Mennonite CPS workers proved that courage took forms the society fighting for freedom hadn't initially recognized. Samuel Yoder, walking into Ward B and choosing to feed hungry patients, bathe those lying in filth, and document suffering that others ignored, required different strength than firing weapons on battlefield. Both forms of service required willingness to sacrifice, one through violence, one through non-violence. Both tested commitment to principles under pressure, and both, ultimately, contributed to values the nation claimed to defend: human dignity, justice, and recognition that every person deserved treatment reflecting their inherent worth regardless of society's judgments about their usefulness or normalcy. Decades after the war ended, the veterans who'd ridiculed conscientious objectors as cowards came to recognize, some of them, that the men who wouldn't fight had demonstrated their own courage by serving humanity in ways that required moral strength as demanding as any battlefield required physical bravery. The quiet service in forgotten asylums, the documentation of suffering society preferred to ignore, the persistence in demanding reforms that powerful interests resisted, these acts revealed that courage wasn't measured exclusively in bullets fired, but sometimes in lives saved, injustices exposed, and principles maintained when the world demanded compromise.